Rafael Nadal just boarded a 14-hour flight to the Philippines, and every single reason traces directly back to Alex Eala, the greatest clay court competitor in tennis history, a man who could train anywhere on earth with anyone on earth, chose Manila deliberately, personally, without corporate obligation or promotional arrangement driving the decision. The world did not whisper about this. It erupted. Because when Rafael Nadal moves, the tennis universe pays attention. And when Rafael Nadal moves 14 hours across the globe to stand on the same court as a 20-year-old Filipino prodigy, the conversation that ignites is not about logistics or scheduling. It is about legacy, about belief, about one legend looking at the future of his sport and deciding that future deserved his physical presence, his personal investment, and 14 hours of altitude above the Pacific Ocean. Nobody manufactured this moment. Nobody engineered it for maximum media impact. It happened because something between these two athletes, mentor and protégé, legend and successor, past and future, demanded it happen. And what unfolded on those Philippine courts when they finally shared the same surface together permanently redefined everything the tennis world thought it understood about where women's tennis is heading. Stay locked in through every chapter, because the final revelation of why Rafael Nadal truly made this journey will leave you questioning everything you assumed about the future of the sport. Retirement from professional sport rarely arrives cleanly. For most athletes, particularly those whose identities were constructed around competitive excellence across decades of relentless dedication, the transition from competitor to something else entirely is neither linear nor painless. The body retires before the mind agrees. The schedule empties before the hunger does. The sport continues without you while you recalibrate an existence that was previously organized entirely around its demands. Rafael Nadal retired from professional tennis in late 2024. The announcement arrived through a video statement that was simultaneously characteristic of him, direct, emotionally honest, without theatrical embellishment, and devastating to absorb for anyone who had spent years watching him compete with a ferocity that seemed to defy the ordinary limitations of human physical endurance. 22 Grand Slam titles, 14 French Open crowns, a number so improbable that it still requires a deliberate cognitive effort to process as real rather than mythological. World number one for weeks spanning across an era that produced three of the greatest players the sport had ever assembled simultaneously. A Davis Cup record with Spain that represented collective excellence matching his individual brilliance. The legacy was complete, architecturally perfect, requiring no addition. And yet Nadal, characteristically, did not interpret retirement as permission for disengagement. The competitive fire that had carried him through injuries that would have permanently ended most careers, through a scaphoid stress fracture, through chronic Mueller-Weiss syndrome in his left foot, through abdominal tears and hip flexor damage, and every category of physical punishment that 2 decades of elite professional tennis distributes, that fire did not extinguish when the tour schedule disappeared from his calendar. It redirected. The Rafa Nadal Academy in Manacor, Majorca, had always been his most significant off-court investment. Not financially, though the financial commitment was substantial, but personally. He had designed it as an institution that reflected his competitive philosophy precisely. Excellence without shortcuts, character alongside technique, mental resilience treated as seriously as physical conditioning. The whole-person development approach that his own career had demonstrated was the only architecture capable of sustaining greatness across an extended period. After retirement, his involvement deepened rather than diminished. He was present on the practice courts with regularity that surprised those who assumed post-competitive freedom would pull his attention toward the beaches and restaurants of Majorca rather than its tennis facilities. He worked directly with coaches. He observed developing players with the analytical attention of someone whose competitive knowledge had accumulated across 22 years of the highest stakes problem solving in professional sport. And among all the players whose development he watched with particular attention, whose trajectory he tracked with the specific focus of someone who had invested genuine belief in their potential, one name occupied a category entirely its own. Alex Eala had been at his academy long enough for Nadal to observe not just her technical development, but her character under pressure. The quality he valued above every other athletic attribute, the capacity to maintain competitive clarity when the environment surrounding you becomes genuinely hostile, was something Ayala demonstrated with a consistency he described, to people closest to him, as reminiscent of qualities he had recognized in himself during his own formative years. That comparison, from that source, carried a weight that no ranking or trophy could replicate. And as 2025 unfolded and the controversy surrounding Ayala accumulated, the YTA regulatory battles, the Nike and Adidas commercial earthquakes, the institutional frictions that had placed her name at the center of every significant conversation in women's tennis, Nadal watched from Mallorca with mounting conviction that his most celebrated protégé needed something beyond remote support and occasional communication. She needed presence, his presence, on her ground, in her country, on courts surrounded by the people whose belief in her had been the bedrock of everything she had constructed. The decision to fly 14 hours to Manila was not impulsive. It was the considered conclusion of someone who understood from deep personal experience exactly what a young champion needs at the precise moment when the weight of external pressure threatens to outpace the internal architecture supporting their competitive foundation. When Rafael Nadal decided Alex Eala needed him in the Philippines, he went to the Philippines. No committee approved it. No publicist engineered it. No sponsor funded the journey with attached promotional obligations. He simply went because she deserved it, because he believed in her. And 14 hours is nothing when the destination matters enough.
There are moments in a country's sporting history that transcend the specific event producing them and become something larger. Collective memories that a nation carries forward as evidence of its own significance on the global stage. Rafael Nadal's arrival in Manila was one of those moments. The news broke approximately 6 hours before his flight landed, enough time for social media to achieve full mobilization, but not enough time for the reception to feel manufactured or orchestrated. What materialized at Ninoy Aquino International Airport was entirely organic, spontaneous, the specific kind of crowd that assembles not because anyone organized it, but because word traveled fast enough and people cared deeply enough to simply appear. Hundreds gathered outside the terminal, Philippine flags mixed with handmade signs bearing Eala's name alongside Nadal's. Sports journalists who covered tennis for national publications arrived alongside bloggers and content creators, and ordinary fans who had taken personal leave from work because this was, in their genuine assessment, a legitimate reason to take personal leave from work. The images circulated globally within minutes of his emergence from the terminal. Nadal, characteristically relaxed in the specific way that genuine confidence produces, not performing ease but actually possessing it, moved through the reception with the warmth of someone genuinely moved by the scale of the welcome rather than merely tolerating its inconvenience. He spoke briefly to assembled media. His words were simple, direct, and, in their simplicity, more powerful than any prepared statement could have achieved. He said he was in Manila because Alex Eala deserved the best preparation available. He said she had always given everything the Academy asked of her, and significantly more. He said coming to her country was the least complicated decision he had made in recent memory. Those 3 sentences ricocheted across Philippine social media with the velocity of a national emergency broadcast. Except instead of alarm, they carried something the country had been accumulating in reserve across years of watching Eala compete against institutional resistance and commercial turbulence with her composure perpetually, magnificently intact. Pride. The specific, overwhelming, historically validated pride of a nation that had been told, implicitly and explicitly, that its athletes were welcome to participate in elite international sport, but not quite expected to matter at its highest levels, and was now watching the greatest player of his generation fly across the Pacific specifically to invest his irreplaceable time and knowledge in one of their own. Philippine media mobilized comprehensively. Every major television network led with the story. Sports columnists who had covered Eala's journey from her earliest professional appearances found themselves writing the chapter they had always hoped was coming, but never quite allowed themselves to project as inevitable. Senators and government officials issued statements. The Philippine Sports Commission released congratulations that carried visible emotional weight beneath the official language. But the person whose response mattered most above any institutional or media reaction was, characteristically, the one who said least publicly. Alex Eala greeted Nadal at the training facility she had arranged in Manila, a venue that combined professional-grade infrastructure with the particular atmosphere of a place where she had trained during childhood, before Mallorca and Grand Slams and WTA tours and commercial controversies had transformed her relationship with the sport into something simultaneously grander and more complicated than it had been when she was simply a young girl hitting balls because she loved what happened when racket connected perfectly with felt. The reunion between mentor and protégé, captured in photographs that circulated immediately and globally, showed something that statistics and rankings and contract figures cannot quantify. It showed 2 people who had invested genuine trust in each other across years of shared commitment to a standard of excellence that neither of them was willing to compromise. Now occupying the same physical space, on her ground, in her country, surrounded by her people. What happened on those courts over the training days that followed belonged, in its most essential dimension, to both of them. But its significance radiated outward to touch every young athlete in the Philippines who had ever been told that their dreams required leaving everything familiar behind to be taken seriously. Nadal had just demonstrated, with 14 hours of flight time and everything that followed, that sometimes the mountain comes to the climber. And the world, watching from every time zone simultaneously, was genuinely, completely, beautifully shocked. Training sessions between elite athletes carry a specific electricity that ordinary practice environments never generate. When 2 competitors, even across the gender divide, even across the generational gap, even across the gulf between active professional and recently retired legend, share a court with genuine competitive intention driving both of them, something observable and measurable happens. Standards elevate without instruction. The presence of excellence creates a gravitational field that pulls performance upward simply through proximity. What occurred on the Manila training courts during the days Nadal spent with Eala generated accounts from witnesses, coaches, academy staff, journalists granted controlled access, that converged on a single, consistent description. It was extraordinary. Not extraordinary in the sense of unexpected excellence from either participant. Those present knew what both were capable of individually. Extraordinary in the specific sense of 2 tennis minds operating at frequencies that synchronized in ways that produced something greater than either generated independently. Nadal brought the accumulated tactical intelligence of 22 Grand Slams, the specific, granular, deeply embodied knowledge of how to construct points against opponents of every style under conditions of maximum pressure. How to identify the geometric weakness in an opponent's positioning before they have recognized it themselves. How to manufacture angles from defensive positions that most players would concede as lost. How to use pace and spin and placement in combinations that create problems compounding faster than opponents can solve them. Eala brought something that Nadal had identified years earlier at his academy, and which the intervening period of professional competition had refined rather than diminished. She brought the capacity to absorb tactical instruction and implement it immediately, not approximately, not directionally, but precisely. Coaches who had worked with her consistently described this quality as among the rarest they had encountered in any developing player. The gap between understanding a concept intellectually and executing it physically under competitive pressure is where most athletes lose months or years of development. For Eala, that gap was measurably, demonstrably narrower than in virtually any other player they had coached. The combination of Nadal's knowledge and Eala's absorption capacity produced training exchanges that witnesses described as unlike anything they had observed in a practice environment. He would demonstrate a tactical pattern, a specific shot combination designed to exploit a particular defensive positioning, and she would execute it at functional level within repetitions that experienced coaches estimated would require most professional players significantly more time to approximate. He pushed her, not gently, not with the measured encouragement of a mentor performing support for an audience. He pushed her the way he had always operated, with the genuine competitive intensity of someone who believes that real respect for another athlete's potential manifests through demanding the absolute maximum of what they can produce. She responded, every time, with the specific competitive stubbornness, the refusal to accept that a standard had been reached before she had fully extended towards it, that Nadal recognized because it was the quality he had always recognized most readily in other athletes. He had it himself. He knew precisely what it looked like in someone else. Between the competitive intensity of the on-court exchanges, there were conversations, long ones reportedly, sessions where rackets were set aside and the dialogue shifted from tactical to something broader, about the mental architecture of sustained excellence, about navigating the specific psychological pressures of carrying national expectation, about the relationship between external controversy and internal competitive focus. Nadal had navigated every category of external pressure that Eala was currently experiencing: institutional friction, commercial disruption, the particular weight of representing not just yourself, but an entire country's sporting identity. He spoke from direct experience. She listened with the attention of someone who understood that the person across from her had not merely survived those pressures, but had transcended them repeatedly across a career spanning 2 decades. What transferred between them on those courts was not simply technique or tactical knowledge. It was something rarer and more durable. It was the specific confidence that comes from having your potential validated by someone who has no professional obligation to validate it, who chooses to invest their irreplaceable time and knowledge not because a contract requires it, but because they genuinely believe in what you are capable of becoming. That kind of confidence doesn't expire between tournaments. It doesn't weaken under institutional pressure or commercial turbulence. It becomes load-bearing, a structural element of the competitive identity that holds everything else in position when the external environment becomes genuinely hostile. Nadal gave Alex Eala that, on her courts, in her country, in front of her people. And the tennis world, watching the accounts emerge from those training days, understood something with sudden, complete clarity. Alex Eala was not simply rising, she was being prepared, deliberately, personally, by the greatest champion his sport had ever produced.
The global reaction to Nadal's Manila visit operated on multiple frequencies simultaneously, each revealing a different dimension of why this single gesture carried implications extending far beyond one training trip between mentor and protégé. The tennis community's response was immediate and layered. Current players on both the ATP and WTA tours processed the news through the lens of their own relationships with the sport's legends and the mentorship structures available to them during their developmental years. Several spoke openly about what it would have meant to their own careers to have someone of Nadal's stature invest that category of personal attention in their preparation. The consensus was consistent. What Ayala was receiving was not merely extraordinary, it was generationally unique. Sports analysts who cover the commercial dimensions of professional tennis immediately began assessing the implications for Ayala's already explosive brand trajectory. If her merchandise numbers and sponsorship appeal had been volcanic before Nadal's arrival, the sustained global coverage of his 14-hour journey to Manila, covered by mainstream international media extending well beyond sports pages into general news cycles, represented a promotional amplification that no marketing budget could have purchased. Her name now occupied the same sentence as Nadal's in coverage distributed across every major global media market simultaneously. The association was not manufactured or metaphorical. It was documented, photographed, witnessed, and reported. She had trained personally with Rafael Nadal, on her own courts, in her own country, at his initiative. That association does not depreciate. It compounds across every future achievement she accumulates. The debate that erupted in certain analytical tennis circles was more pointed and more interesting than simple celebration. Commentators who examined the structural dynamics of women's tennis with genuine critical rigor raised questions about what Nadal's visit revealed regarding the support infrastructure available to elite women players versus the mentorship ecosystem surrounding the men's game. The argument was not anti-Nadal. His gesture was universally acknowledged as genuinely extraordinary. The argument was systemic. Why did it require one of the greatest male players in history to fly privately across the Pacific to provide world-class mentorship to a WTA player when the women's tour should possess institutional mechanisms for delivering that category of developmental support without depending on the personal generosity of legends from a different circuit? The question was uncomfortable. It was also completely legitimate. And it opened a broader conversation about whether the WTA's investment in player development, particularly for players from nations outside the traditional tennis power structures, matched the organization's stated commitments to nurturing diverse global talent. In the Philippines, those analytical debates were largely secondary to something more visceral and more important. The national response to Nadal's visit achieved a cultural penetration that no sporting event in recent Philippine history had matched. Morning television programs dedicated extended segments to analyzing what his presence meant for the country's global sporting profile. Schools reported students arriving with printed photographs of Nadal and Eala on the Manila courts. Youth tennis enrollment inquiries at clubs and academies across the archipelago spiked with the specific velocity associated with moments when a sport suddenly becomes personally relevant to communities that had previously engaged with it from a comfortable distance. Ayala had always been a hero in the Philippines. She became, in the week of Nadal's visit, something closer to a national institution. The distinction matters. Heroes inspire admiration. Institutions become part of how a culture understands itself. The Philippines was beginning to understand itself as a country that produced athletes capable of attracting the personal investment of the greatest champions the world had ever seen. That understanding, once established, does not disappear when the next news cycle arrives. When the training sessions concluded and the departure approached, Nadal gave an extended interview to Philippine media that stands as perhaps the most revealing public statement he has made since retiring from professional competition. He spoke without notes, without prepared language carefully vetted through communications teams. He spoke the way he had always competed. Directly, authentically, with the specific vulnerability of someone who had long ago decided that honesty was more valuable than image management. He said that Alex Eala reminded him of what he had been at 20. Not technically, their games carry distinct architectural signatures shaped by different bodies, different surfaces, different competitive contexts. He meant something more internal, the relationship between hunger and discipline, the capacity to want something completely without allowing that wanting to destabilize the methodical daily work required to achieve it. The understanding at a cellular level that greatness is not a destination you arrive at, but a standard you choose to inhabit every single day, regardless of external recognition or institutional support.
He said that watching her navigate the controversies of the preceding months, the regulatory battles, the commercial disruptions, the institutional frictions, with her competitive focus demonstrably intact, had confirmed something he had believed since her earliest days at his academy: that she possessed the mental architecture not just to win tournaments, but to sustain excellence across the duration required to build a genuinely historic career. He said, with the directness of someone who measures words carefully and therefore means every one deployed, that he believed she would win Grand Slams, plural, not as a hope or a projection, as an assessment grounded in 20 years of competitive experience that had taught him precisely what the combination of talent, mental constitution, and competitive character produces when allowed to develop fully. Those words, from that source, landed in the Philippine sporting consciousness with the force of prophecy endorsed by the most credible prophet the game had ever produced. But the most significant revelation of that interview was not about Ayala's future, it was about Nadal's understanding of his own responsibility in shaping it. He described his retirement not as departure from tennis, but repositioning within it. The competitive chapter had concluded. The chapter of transmission, of passing forward the specific knowledge accumulated across 22 years of the highest stakes competition imaginable, was beginning. And he decided, with the same deliberateness he brought to every significant decision of his career, that transmission required presence, physical, personal, undiluted presence. Flying 14 hours to Manila was not a gesture, it was a methodology, the first application of a post-competitive philosophy built on the conviction that the knowledge he carried deserved to be delivered directly, not through media interviews or masterclass videos or the diluted transmission of institutional curricula, but court to court, player to player, in the specific environment where the recipient's roots ran deepest. He chose Manila because Ayala deserved to receive his investment on her own ground, in the country that had shaped her before any academy refined her, surrounded by the people whose belief preceded every trophy and every ranking point and every commercial contract by years of patient, faithful anticipation. That choice, geographic, deliberate, deeply respectful of what home means to an athlete who carries their country on every court they compete on, revealed more about Rafael Nadal's character in post-competitive life than any victory speech had revealed about it during competition. He understood something that institutions frequently miss and individuals occasionally gloriously get right. To truly invest in someone's future, you must first honor where they come from. He honored it with 14 hours of flight time and every hour on those Manila courts that followed. And Alex Eala, who had navigated regulatory obstruction, commercial earthquakes, and institutional indifference with her composure perpetually, magnificently intact, finally, briefly, allowed herself to receive the full weight of what that investment meant. The cameras captured her expression in one specific moment during their final session, not performing gratitude, not managing public perception, simply present, simply moved, simply a 20-year-old athlete standing on the courts of her childhood, training with the greatest champion of his generation in the country that had believed in her before the world knew her name. That image required no caption. It required no analysis. It was complete exactly as it existed. And if you want to understand what women's tennis is genuinely becoming, what the sport looks like when its most promising future intersects with its most honorable past, that image is the most accurate answer available. The only question remaining is not whether Alex Eala will reach the summit of her sport. It is whether the institutions surrounding her will evolve rapidly enough to deserve the credit when she arrives, or whether they will spend that moment explaining why they tried to slow her down. Rafael Nadal flew 14 hours to the Philippines because he understood something the rest of the world was still catching up to.
Alex Eala is not simply a promising young player navigating a complicated moment in her developing career. She is the future of women's tennis, arriving ahead of every projected schedule, carrying a country's complete and